Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, and I'm coming to you from my hermitage in Lynchburg. Philosopher, historian, Thomas Jefferson scholar, author of 20 books on Jefferson, as well as close to 150 published essays. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the 1619 thesis in a talk titled The 1619 Project, Profiteering from Farcicality. In August 2019, the New York Times, prompted by a notion of Nicole Hannah-Jones, began its 1619 project, an attempt to rewrite completely America's history by considering the year 1619 as the real birth of the American nation. In the words of New York Times Magazine editor-in-chief Jay Silverstein, 1619 is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, we were to tell you that the moment that the country's defining contradictions first came into the world was late August of 1619? That was when a ship arrived from Point Comfort in the British colony of Virginia, bearing a cargo of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. Their arrival inaugurated a barbaric system of chattel slavery that would last for the next 250 years. This is sometimes referred to as the country's original sin, but it's more than that. It's the country's very origin. Out of slavery and anti-black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatred that continue to plague it to this day. The seeds of all that were planted long before our official birth date in 1776, when the men knew as our founders formally declared independence from Britain. The goal of 1619 Project is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of story we wish to tell ourselves about who we are as a country. Now, the thesis has been met promptly with outrage by many of the country's leading historians: Gordon Wood, Victoria Bynum, James McPherson, James Oakes, and Sean Wilentz. A letter to the magazine framed by Wilentz and signed by those and other leading historians called the project a displacement of historical understanding by ideology. The historians demanded corrections. Silverstein responded with a sort of concession. The 1619 thesis was not an attempt to rewrite history in toto, but meant to be considered as a supplemental to traditional approaches to teaching of the country's beginning. That concession is hard to swallow, given Silverstein's claim concerning reframing American history around the year of introduction of the first blacks from Africa. The term reframing implies change of some sort. When one reframes a picture, one changes the frame and discards the old frame. It's likewise with a historical thesis concerning some event, here the founding of our country. Moreover, there is the clear claim that arrival of the first ship of black slave is the country's very origin. There is one conspicuous omission, that of the boatloads of white slaves comprising mudsills and the superfluous, from prostitutes, urchins, and the Irish prisoners, the penurious, and the parentless that were brought into the New World prior to the cargo of 1619. Is it because they were white that they are not part of the country's original sin? The implications of the 1619 thesis are prodigious. No longer is the narrative centered on the founding fathers' struggles for colonial liberation from the oppressive mother country. We begin instead with the country's original sin. The centuries-old struggle of heroic resistance and eventual liberation through triumph against oppression in war is now subrogated by primal guilt through original sin. Heroism is subrogated by guilt. Anti-black racism, says Silverstein, gave birth to unexampled and abusive economic power. The failure of the Electoral College, America's unique food and music, failures of healthcare and education, America's penchant for violence, the ever-widening gap between rich and poor, degenerative American slang, American injustice and racial paranoia, and all such things began because in 1619, 20 blacks were voted into Virginia. There is nothing, it seems, salvageable in such a completely corrupt system. Now, this is an intriguing story, which, if true, invites us to cast into oblivion all subsequent accounts of the founding of the United States. Anti-black racism, not heroism, is at the core of America's story. Now, the thesis suffers from one rather incommodious defect. It is scandalously vacuous, i.e., bullshit. Hannah Jones, an African-American who thought up the thesis, proudly vaunted with the launching of the thesis that sales of New York Times Magazine went, as it were, through the roof. They had not seen, and I quote here, they had not seen this type of demand for a print product of the New York Times since 2008, when people wanted copies of Obama's historic presidency edition. There is historical revisionism, and then there is historical revisionism, the sort of revisionism that bids us to forget all that we thought we knew and to begin anew. Is this instance of historical revisionism of the latter sort earnest, or is it all about the Benjamins? It goes without questioning that Silverstein and Hannah Jones have profited monetarily with publication of such a draconian thesis. Draconianism is today what drives radical racial revisionism, and the Dracos to them are all those whites who are not supportive of the sort of ultra-leftism that demands wholesale self-hatred and nation hatred. Yet, I think that Silverstein and Hannah Jones are among the I scarcely think that Silverstein and Hannah Jones are among the penurious in the gap between the rich and poor. To help to alleviate the problem of the haves and have-nots, does Silverstein, as editor of his magazine, he certainly makes a handsome salary and probably suffered a bonus with the through-the-roof sales of the 1619 project. Does he donate the lion's share of his hefty salary to America's poor or to programs aimed to narrow the rich-poor gap? He and Hannah Jones doubtless benefit handsomely from such a system, inveterately rooted in white hatred. What follows from the 1619 project? It seems that all whites not buying into their thesis are to admit their primal guilt and deracinate, to uproot all American history rooted in the Founding Fathers myth. Yet what is to become of white primal guilt? It seems, given Silverstein's bleak depiction of today's America, that whites can either wallow in their irremediable guilt, or they, to eradicate their primal guilt, can destroy the system and begin afresh. It is most inconvenient that neither Silverstein nor Hannah Jones proffer an answer. That is distressing, for given the decrepitude of our country, America is despairingly in need of answers from its wisest citizens. Given that they have disclosed that the soul of Americanism is not love of liberty and championing of human rights, but instead white hatred and deep-rooted guilt, we are certainly in need of their providential guidance, their providential wisdom. Silverstein and Hannah Jones conveniently seem to forget that it is because of the valiant deeds of the founding men and the women behind them, We are today in a place where, and at a time when, we can entertain and discuss radical and vacuous theses like the 1619 Project. The problem today is that such discussions are rarely rational. Emotive language fraught with pomposity, metaphors, and hyperboles, consider at least Silverstein's quote-unquote paean for America, all the degeneracies that have come to characterize American society because of our hatred, because of our racism. This predominates in such discussions to such an extent that complaints and demands of the country's leading historians are merely overpassed. Vacuousness in vogue today is as reasonable as rationality, and it does not hurt to sell a few newspapers and magazines in the process. The signer of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence signed off on the equality of all men, black men included, so the obsolescence of slavery was merely a matter of time. Most signers, I am sure, were aware of that. But sentences have implications. Those sentences which the 1619 Thesis comprises are I firmly assert, are inflammatorily dangerous not only because they invite wholesale revolution, but also because they do more to inflame racial tensions than to heal racial wounds, which require time to heal. Continued self-flagellation at some point becomes absurd. It is time to move forward. The equality of all humans articulated in Jefferson's Declaration was not Jefferson's creation, yet it was a new concept, relatively new. Slavery had been extant for millennia, and it still exists in pockets of the globe, and it was and is not merely enslavement of blacks by whites. Yet it has only been with the Enlightenment thinking of Jefferson's day that people began to entertain seriously human equality. The Founding Fathers signed off on that equality, even if all were not convinced of its truth. They made it possible that that thesis, aimed at destroying their sublime thoughts and prodigious efforts, could be entertained. It is astonishing that Silverstein and Hannah-Jones fail to see that, though perhaps they do and merely don't care to address it. They have, of course, been encouraged in their foolishness by an ignorant public thirsting for scandalous farcicality, a farcicality that has earned Hannah-Jones, most farcically of all, the Pulitzer Prize. It is time to note that the prize itself has become farcical. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.